Elon Musk rolled into a small town in his Cybertruck, the angular beast humming down an old, worn-out road. Dust swirled in the wind, nudging rusty signs along the way. One read Eddie's parts shop. A dog barked faintly in the distance, and a scratchy radio tune drifted out from inside, fading in and out with static. The shop sat there, forgotten by time, gathering dust and old memories. Elon Musk swung open the Cybertruck's sharp-edged door, stepped out, and pushed through the shop's entrance as the doorbell jingled. Eddie, the grumpy old man who ran the place, hunched over the counter, flipping through a tattered parts catalog. He'd been at it for years, 40 or more, fixing up whatever folks brought in, from cars to tractors. He sipped his black coffee, muttering about how slow the day dragged, when the bell chimed. He glanced up, squinting through smudged glasses, as Elon shut the door gently and stepped forward. To Eddie, this tall guy in simple jeans and a black t-shirt, holding a small notebook, was just another customer barging in. He didn't recognize him, not yet. The shop was a mess, dusty shelves crammed with old engine parts, rusty bolts scattered around, and a beat-up coffee maker humming in the corner. The radio buzzed with "Stand By Me," cutting through static. "What you looking for?" Eddie grumbled, barely lifting his eyes from the catalog. Elon opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, Frank, a regular lingering by the back shelves, cut in. "Hold up, ain't that Elon Musk? The SpaceX and Tesla guy?" Heads turned fast. Clara, a woman browsing nearby, let out a gasp. "No way, that's him." In seconds, a couple of folks pulled out their phones, crowding around. "Can we get a picture, man?" one asked, adding, "I'm posting this to X." Elon nodded with a small smile, posing briefly, but Eddie's question hung there, unanswered. Irritation simmered inside Eddie. Who did this guy think he was, blowing him off? And the air started to thicken with tension. Elon Musk stood in the middle of Eddie's parts shop, a small crowd buzzing around him like flies on a summer day. Frank, a wiry old regular with a scruffy beard, clutched a rusty chain he'd been eyeing for his tractor, grinning ear to ear. "Man, I knew it was you the second I saw that Cybertruck roll up. Ain't nobody in this town got anything half as wild as that thing," he said, his voice loud with excitement. Clara, a plump woman in her 60s with a faded floral blouse, nodded eagerly, her phone already in hand. She'd snapped a quick photo of Elon and was tapping away at the screen. "My grandkids ain't gonna believe I met the Tesla guy," she muttered, her fingers fumbling over the keys. "This is going straight to their group chat." A scruffy kid in a backward baseball cap, barely out of his teens, shoved his way closer, phone held high. "Can we get a picture, man?" he asked, then added with a smirk. "I'm posting this to X. Gonna get 1,000,000 likes, watch." Elon gave a quick nod and a polite smile, hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, his small notebook dangling loosely from one fist. He stood there in his black t-shirt, tall and unbothered, letting them snap away. Eddie watched all this from behind the counter, his chipped coffee mug growing cold in his grip. The shop wasn't big, just a cramped little hole in the wall with creaky floors and a faint smell of oil and burnt coffee lingering in the air. He'd asked a simple question. "What you looking for?" And still hadn't gotten a damn answer. The chatter grated on him, each laugh and click of a camera digging deeper under his skin. He'd been running this place for over 40 years, patching up engines, selling bolts, and keeping the town's beat-up machines alive. It was his turf, his rules, and now it felt like some circus had rolled in without his say-so. He cleared his throat, loud and rough, trying to cut through the racket. "Hey, you deaf or something?" he barked, his voice sharper than he'd meant. "I said, what you looking for?" He didn't care if he sounded rude, this guy, whoever he was, waltzing in with his fancy truck and turning everything upside down wasn't sitting right. Elon turned away from the crowd, finally locking eyes with Eddie. "Sorry about that," he said, stepping up to the counter with an easy stride. "I'm looking for a carburetor valve. For a 1965 motorcycle. Got anything like that in stock?" His tone was calm, almost too calm, like he hadn't noticed the irritation boiling off Eddie. The others quieted down a bit, sensing the shift in the room, but Frank couldn't resist. A motorcycle? What, you building a rocket bike now? He chuckled, nudging Clara with his elbow. She smirked, her eyes darting between Elon and Eddie, but Eddie didn't crack a smile. His fingers tightened around the catalog, the brittle pages crinkling under his grip. He'd seen plenty of big shots come through over the years, guys with shiny cars and loud mouths. But this one was different, and it was rubbing him the wrong way. 1965, huh? Eddie muttered, flipping through the catalog with more force than needed. The pages flapped loudly, a few tearing at the edges as he scanned the faded print. Old stuff. Might have had one last year, maybe even last month, but I'd have to check the back. Ain't promising nothing. He paused, then shot Elon a hard look over the rim of his smudged glasses. You gonna wait around? Were you too busy posing for your fan club over there? The words dripped with sarcasm, his voice low and gruff. The air in the shop grew heavy, thick with the weight of Eddie's frustration. Frank stopped chuckling, Clara lowered her phone, and the kid with the cap stepped back, sensing the mood souring. Elon didn't flinch, just stood there with that same steady look, his notebook resting lightly against the counter. But Eddie's patience was fraying fast. Some hotshot ignoring him in his own shop, his own little kingdom, was more than he could stomach. He slammed the catalog shut, the thud echoing off the dusty walls, and leaned forward, waiting for an answer. Outside, the Cybertruck sat parked in the dirt lot, its sharp edges glinting in the afternoon sun. Inside, the radio kept buzzing, the coffee maker kept humming, and the tension kept building. Eddie didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just about a part. It was about something bigger, something that'd stick with him long after the day was done. Elon Musk leaned against the counter, his black t-shirt slightly wrinkled from the day's heat, his posture relaxed despite the faint edge simmering in the air. The thud of the catalog slamming shut still lingered, a sharp note cutting through the dull hum of Eddie's parts shop. The place felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward as if Eddie's glare carried a tangible weight, heavy and unyielding. Frank had shuffled back to the shelves, his wiry frame hunched over a rusty chain he'd been eyeing for his tractor, pretending to be busy while sneaking glances at the brewing tension. Clara, her floral blouse dusted with grime from brushing a shelf, slipped her phone into her purse, muttering about groceries and how the store would close soon if she didn't get moving. The kid with the backward cap lingered a bit longer, scrolling through his ex post with a smirk, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the worn floorboards as he shifted his weight. Thanks, man, he called out, tossing a lazy wave over his shoulder before pushing through the door, the bell jingling briefly as he exited. The crowd thinned out, leaving just Elon and Eddie in the dim, dusty glow of the shop, the air thick with unspoken friction, like a storm gathering over a parched field. Eddie crossed his arms over his chest, his gray hair sticking out in sweaty, tangled clumps, his eyes narrowing as he locked his stare on Elon. So you're serious about this Valve thing? He said, his voice rough, a gritty mix of disbelief and irritation grinding together like sandpaper on raw wood. Folks like you don't usually come poking around places like this for old junk. He jerked his head toward the window, pointing out Elon's car gleaming in the sun outside, its sharp lines a jarring contrast to the shop's faded, peeling paint and chipped edges. Elon glanced over for a moment, his eyes tracing the vehicle's outline against the dirt lot, then turned back with a small shrug. It's not junk to me, he said, his words plain but carrying a quiet, steady weight. That bike, it's been a project for a while. Something I've been piecing together bit by bit. Means more than you'd think. Eddie snorted, a harsh sound that sliced through the stillness, and uncrossed his arms to grab his coffee mug. He lifted it to his lips, only to grimace at the cold, bitter dregs inside, the taste sharp and stale against his tongue. He set it down with a clink that echoed off the cluttered shelves, the noise piercing the low hum of the coffee maker buzzing away in the corner. Yeah, well, I ain't your personal scavenger, he muttered, his tone gruff and clipped, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his tired, bloodshot eyes. He'd heard every kind of story over the decades. Guys chasing parts for their dad's old pickup, their first beat-up ride, some rusty relic tied to a faded memory. But this guy didn't fit the mold. too polished, too steady, too out of place in a shop that reeked of oil, burnt coffee, and the sour tang of regret. "What's so special about it?" he asked, almost against his better judgment, leaning back in his creaky chair, the wood groaning under his weight like it might collapse under the strain. Elon set his notebook on the counter with a soft thud, flipping it open to a page covered in scribbled notes, and a rough pencil sketch of a motorcycle, lines jagged but precise, a labor of care scratched into the worn paper. "It's a 1965 model," he said, tapping the drawing with a finger, the faintest trace of grease smudging the edge from his touch. "Picked it up a while back, half busted. Used to ride something like it when I was a kid, nothing fancy, just a worn-out thing I'd mess with after school." His voice softened, a rare crack breaking through his usual calm, and for a moment, he wasn't the billionaire or the tech genius, just a guy talking about a kid with greasy hands and a stubborn dream, a flicker of nostalgia softening his sharp edges. Eddie caught that shift, that fleeting glimpse of something raw and real, and it stirred something deep in him, a memory he hadn't touched in years, though he never admitted out loud, not to this guy, not to anyone. "Kid stuff, huh?" Eddie said, his tone easing up just a fraction, the jagged edges smoothing out as he spoke. He pushed his smudged glasses up his nose with a calloused finger, squinting at the sketch, the lines blurring slightly under the dim light filtering through the grimy, fingerprint-streaked windows. "Sounds like a pain in the ass. Why not just buy a new one? Bet you could snap up a dozen without blinking." It was half a jab, half a genuine question, his voice hovering between sarcasm and curiosity, testing the waters like a fisherman casting a line. Elon didn't bite, didn't flinch, just traced the pencil lines on the page with a slow, deliberate touch, his fingertip lingering on the curve of the bike's frame. "New's not the same," he replied, his voice steady but carrying a hint of something deeper, a quiet conviction. "This one's got scars, mine did too. Reminds me of where I started, you know?" He looked up, meeting Eddie's gaze across the counter, and there was a quiet honesty in his eyes, a sincerity that threw Eddie off balance, leaving him grasping for a response. For a moment, the old man sat there, words stuck in his throat, his mind wrestling with something that hit too close to home, a past he'd locked away behind decades of grease, grumbling, and the steady rhythm of fixing what others broke. The shop's radio crackled on, spitting out a faint melody between bursts of static, the sound tinny and uneven as it bounced off the cluttered shelves stacked with old parts, carburetors, bolts, gaskets, all coated in a fine layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, its steady drone a backdrop to the moment, oblivious to the weight settling between the two men like a fog rolling in slow and thick. Eddie shifted in his seat, the silence gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't reach, his fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest of his chair. He'd spent decades behind that counter, surrounded by grease-stained parts and the ghosts of machines long gone, fixing what he could and cursing what he couldn't, day after day blending into a haze of routine. This was different though. This guy, with his calm voice and fancy sketches, was kicking up dust Eddie had buried years ago, memories of his own scratched-up dreams, his own stubborn fights with rusted bolts and broken promises he'd rather leave undisturbed. "All right," he grunted, hauling himself up with a groan, his knees popping loudly as he stood, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. "I'll check the back. Don't get your hopes up, stuff that old don't hang around long in a place like this." He shuffled toward the narrow door behind the counter, his heavy boots scuffing the worn floorboards, kicking up little clouds of dust that floated lazily in the slanted light streaming through the cracks. Elon watched him move, his eyes tracking the old man's slow, deliberate steps, then leaned forward slightly, his voice slipping through the air with a gentle nudge that carried a subtle sting. "Oh, so you're finally getting to it?" he said, his tone light but laced with a faint edge, a polite jab born from the weariness of Eddie's endless probing. "I was starting to wonder if you'd just keep grilling me all day or actually see if you've got what I need." It wasn't harsh, not loud, but there was a flicker of impatience there, a quiet poke at Eddie's dragging feet and relentless questions, the kind of comment that could slide under your skin if you let it. Eddie froze mid-step, one hand resting on the doorframe, his shoulders stiffening as he turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits behind his smudged glasses. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped, his voice low and gravelly, irritation flaring up again like a spark hitting dry tinder, ready to catch fire. Elon didn't back down, didn't raise his voice, just held Eddie's gaze with that same steady calm, his hands resting lightly on the counter. "Just saying," he replied, his words measured. "You've asked me plenty. Thought maybe we'd get to the part where you check instead of playing 20 questions. I need that valve, not a debate." The comment hung there, soft but pointed, a challenge wrapped in that unruffled delivery, and the air thickened, the tension coiling tighter between them like a spring wound too far. Eddie's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the doorframe until his knuckles whitened, the faint creak of wood under his hand audible in the stillness. "I ain't playing games, hotshot," he growled, his temper simmering just below the surface, bubbling up like coffee left too long on the burner. "I said I'd look, didn't I? Don't need you acting like you run the damn place." He took a step toward Elon, his boots thudding heavily against the floor, his chest puffing out slightly as if ready to push back harder, his breath coming in short, sharp huffs. For a second, it looked like the whole thing might boil over. Two stubborn wills clashing in a shop too small to contain them, the air crackling with the promise of something louder, sharper. Frank peeked over from the shelves, his rusty chain forgotten in his hands, his eyebrows creeping up as he watched. Clara, still near the door, hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob, caught in the crossfire of the moment, her eyes darting between the two men. The radio static buzzed louder for a beat, as if it, too, felt the shift, and the coffee maker gurgled on, indifferent to the storm brewing just feet away. But then Eddie stopped, his breath heavy and ragged, and something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or just the weight of too many years pressing down. He'd seen this before, not in Elon, but in himself, years back, when he'd been the one chasing parts, arguing with grumpy old shopkeepers who didn't give a damn, their voices sharp and their patience thinner than his own was now. "Fine," he muttered, his voice softer, the fire dialing back to a smolder. "I'll look. Just hold your horses, all right? Ain't no rush worth this." He shook his head slightly, a tired gesture, and turned back to the door, pushing through into the cluttered back room, his boots echoing faintly as he disappeared into the mess of shelves and shadows. The tension eased, not gone entirely but softened, a thread pulled loose from the knot, and Elon stayed where he was, his notebook still open, his expression unreadable but calm, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. The radio kept crackling, spitting out its faint melody through the static, the coffee maker kept gurgling, and the shop settled into an uneasy quiet. Eddie was gone, rummaging through the chaos of his past, and Elon stood there, waiting, not just for the valve, but for the echoes of that kid who'd once tinkered with a beat-up bike under a flickering garage light, the place where it all began. Elon Musk stood by the counter, his notebook still open to the motorcycle sketch, its pencil lines faint under the shop's dim light. The air settled into an uneasy calm, the tension from moments ago fading like smoke drifting out an open window. The radio crackled on, spitting out a scratchy rendition of an old country tune, the lyrics lost in static but the melody clinging to the edges of the room. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, its steady hum a lifeline in the quiet, and the faint scuff of Eddie's boots echoed from the back room, muffled by the clutter of decades. Elon's eyes drifted to the notebook, his finger brushing the page as if tracing a memory. The kid he'd been, hunched over a rusty bike in a garage that smelled of oil and possibility, the world still small and conquerable. Frank, still lingering by the shelves, set his rusty chain down with a soft clank, the sound pulling Elon's gaze for a moment. The old regular scratched his scruffy beard, his wiry frame slouched against a rack of engine parts, and shuffled closer, curiosity finally getting the better of him. "So, that bike, you really fixing it up yourself?" he asked, his voice rough but warm, like he'd spent too many years shouting over tractor engines. Elon nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. Been at it for a while. Just need that valve to finish it." Frank let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Hell of a thing, a guy like you messing with old junk. Thought you'd be too busy building spaceships or something." He grinned, revealing a gap where a tooth should have been, and leaned in a bit. My old man had a bike like that once, 67 though, not 65. Damn near killed himself on it, but he loved the thing. Elon chuckled softly, the sound light against the shop's heavy air. Sounds about right. Mine wasn't much safer, kept it running with duct tape and hope half the time. Frank laughed, a raspy bark that bounced off the shelves, and for a moment, the shop felt less like a standoff and more like a shared space, the kind of place where stories overlapped in the dust. Clara, who'd been inching toward the door, paused and turned back, her purse clutched tight against her chest. You boys and your toys, she said, her voice sharp but playful, a smirk tugging at her lined face. My late husband was the same, always tinkering with something that'd break down the next week. Drove me up the wall. She shook her head, but her eyes softened, caught in her own memory. The bell jingled again as the kid with the backward cap poked his head back in, his phone still in hand. Yo, that pic's already at 500 likes on X, he called out, grinning wide. I'm viral, man. Elon waved a hand dismissively, but the kid darted back out before he could say anything, leaving the door to swing shut with a thud. Frank snorted. Kids these days can't live without that damn internet. Clara nodded, muttering, my grandkids are the same. Always on those screens. The shop buzzed with their chatter, a low hum of life stirring the stillness, and Elon stood there, half listening, half lost in the sketch under his fingers. Then the back room door creaked open, and Eddie emerged, his boots scuffing louder now, a small, dusty box in his hands. His gray hair was more disheveled, a streak of grime smeared across his forehead from brushing against some forgotten shelf. He looked worn, like the effort had pulled something out of him, but his eyes weren't as hard as before. Found it, he grunted, setting the box on the counter with a dull thud. Carburetor valve, 65 model. Been sitting back there since who knows when. Probably the last one I'll ever see. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving faint streaks of dirt, and glanced at Elon, his expression caught between reluctance and something softer. Maybe pride, maybe just relief. Elon straightened, his eyes locking on the box, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. You're kidding, he said, reaching for it. He lifted the lid, revealing a small, tarnished valve nestled in a bed of crumpled paper, its metal dulled by time but intact. This is it. Exactly what I needed. His voice carried a quiet thrill, the kind that came from seeing a long chase end. Eddie shrugged, but a faint smirk tugged at his lips. Told you I'd look. Didn't say I wouldn't find it. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms again, but the gesture felt less defensive now, more like habit. Frank ambled over, peering at the valve with a nod. Damn, Eddie, you're a regular treasure hunter. Should have known you'd have something buried back there. Clara stepped closer too, her curiosity piqued. Looks like junk to me, she said, but her tone was teasing, her eyes glinting with amusement. Eddie shot her a look. Everything's junk to you till it's yours, Clara. She laughed, a dry cackle that mingled with Frank's raspy chuckle, and the shop warmed with the sound, the edges of the day softening. Elon turned the valve in his hands, inspecting it, then looked up at Eddie. How much? He asked, his tone straightforward but not cold. Eddie scratched his chin, his fingers rasping against stubble, and squinted at the valve like he was sizing it up for the first time. Hell, I don't know. $20? Ain't like I got a price tag on it. Been sitting there collecting dust longer than you've been alive, probably. He paused, then added, gruff but softer. Take it. Finish that damn bike. Sounds like it's worth more to you than it ever was to me. For a moment, Elon didn't say anything, just held Eddie's gaze, the valve cradled in his palm. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Thanks, Eddie. Means a lot. His voice was quiet, steady, but there was something real in it, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Eddie waved a hand, brushing it off, but his eyes lingered on Elon a second longer, a flicker of understanding passing between them, unspoken but felt. The shop hummed on, the radio, the coffee maker, the faint rustle of dust, and for the first time that day, it didn't feel so heavy. Elon Musk stood at the counter, the tarnished valve still cradled in his hand, its weight a quiet victory against the years it had spent buried in Eddie's back room. The shop hummed around him, softer now, the edges of the day worn smooth by the chatter of Frank and Clara, the crackle of the radio, and the steady gurgle of the coffee maker in the corner. Dust floated in the slanted light streaming through the grimy windows, catching the last glow of the afternoon as it spilled across the worn floorboards. Eddie leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his gray hair a mess of sweaty clumps, but his face carried a stillness, a grudging peace that hadn't been there when Elon first walked in. Elon slipped the valve into his pocket, the faint clink of metal against his keys breaking the quiet. He closed his notebook, tucking it under his arm, and looked at Eddie. "You sure about the 20?" he asked, pulling out his wallet, his tone even but carrying a hint of insistence. Eddie waved a hand, the gesture sharp but tired, like he'd swatted away a fly. "Keep it," he grunted. "Ain't worth the hassle of counting change. Just don't come back asking for every damn part in that bike, all right?" His voice was rough, but a flicker of a smirk tugged at his lips, softening the jab. Elon paused, then slipped the wallet back into his pocket with a nod. "Fair enough. Deal's a deal." Frank, still hovering near the shelves, ambled over, his boots scuffing the floor in a lazy rhythm. "You're letting him off easy, Eddie," he said, grinning through his scruffy beard. "Could have squeezed him for at least 50. Guy's got spaceship money, don't he?" He winked at Elon, who chuckled, shaking his head. "Not how it works, Frank. Besides, I'd rather owe Eddie a favor than a fortune." Clara, now perched near the door with her purse slung over her shoulder, piped up. "Oh, don't give him ideas. He'll have you fixing his old truck next time you're in town." She shot Eddie a teasing glance, and he rolled his eyes, muttering, "Like I trust him with my rig." The shop settled into a comfortable rhythm, their voices weaving through the air like threads in a worn quilt. The radio spat out another burst of static, then settled on a slow ballad, the singer's voice low and mournful, a fitting underscore to the moment. Elon glanced toward the window, where his car sat gleaming in the fading sun, a sharp silhouette against the dusty lot. He shifted his weight, the valve a small, solid anchor in his pocket, and turned back to Eddie. "Guess that's it then," he said, his voice steady but carrying a trace of something final. "Bike's getting finished tonight. Been a long time coming." Eddie nodded, his eyes flicking to the floor, then back up to meet Elon's gaze. "Good," he said simply, but there was weight in the word, a gruff acknowledgement of what it meant. He scratched his stubble, his fingers rasping against it, and added, "Don't go crashing the damn thing, hear me? Ain't got another valve to dig up for you." It was half a warning, half a wish, wrapped in his usual growl, but his eyes held a glint of something softer. Concern, maybe, or just the ghost of a shared memory. Elon smiled, a rare, genuine curve of his lips. "I'll keep it upright. Promise." He stepped back from the counter, his boots scuffing lightly against the floor, and gave a small nod to Frank and Clara. "Good meeting you both. Take care." Frank tipped an imaginary hat, grinning. "You too, spaceship man. Don't forget us little folks down here." Clara smirked, adjusting her purse. "Drive safe, those roads get tricky at dusk." Her voice was sharp but warm, a motherly edge honed by years of watching people come and go. The bell jingled as Elon pushed the door open, the sound crisp against the shop's hum. He stepped outside, the late afternoon air hitting him with a rush of warmth and the faint smell of gasoline from the lot. His car gleamed under the sinking sun, its metal catching the light like a polished blade. He paused, glancing back through the street glass, where Eddie still stood behind the counter, Frank and Clara lingering in their spots, the shop a tableau of dust and life frozen for a moment. Then he turned, sliding into the driver's seat, the valve a quiet companion in his pocket. Inside, Eddie watched him go, his arms still crossed, his face unreadable but softer than it had been all day. Frank shuffled back to his chain, muttering something about getting home before dark, and Clara finally pushed through the door, her purse swinging as she headed for her own errands. The radio droned on, the coffee maker gurgled its last drops, and the shop fell into a heavy quiet, the kind that came after something ended. Eddie reached for his mug, found it cold again, and sighed, a long, low sound that carried the weight of the years behind that counter. Outside, the engine purred to life, a low rumble that vibrated through the lot. Elon pulled away, the car kicking up a faint cloud of dust as it rolled toward the road, the horizon swallowing it bit by bit. In his pocket, the valve pressed against his leg, a piece of the past he'd carry forward, a reminder of greasy hands, a beat-up bike, and a shop where, for a moment, time had slowed enough to let two strangers see each other clear.